Welcome to the fifth in a legendary series about the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War started in 1337 and ended 117 years later. Though it began in the age of chivalry, it ended in the age of gunpowder. It started as a dynastic war, then became a total war between nations. Cannons reduced castles to rubble, and acts of great courage happened alongside unspeakable atrocities. By the 1380s, France and England faced new challenges from their own peasants, enraged at the high taxes needed to support almost 40 years of war. The failure of the peasants' revolts weakened feudalism, which in time would give way to tenant farming, and with the peasant crushed, the nobles began to enjoy themselves, squeezing the peasants even harder so that they could have the best of everything. Sophistication and hedonism became the rule of the day in the courts of Europe. Today we'll be talking about the misrule of Richard II in England and its eventual challenge by the Lords Appellant, the promising early years of the reign of Charles VI of France, followed by his tragic descent into madness, and finally a split in the French government which would help to reopen the 100 Years' War. In England, Richard II grew to maturity and chose Anne of Bohemia as his bride, in a marriage arranged by the Pope himself. While it brought the Pope's favor, it brought no money. Indeed, Londoners were so angry at the profitless marriage that they tore down the Bohemian coat of arms wherever they found it. And both Richard and Anna would need a lot of money because Richard soon developed a taste for royal finery. He saw the kingship as a thing of beauty. While his father, the Black Prince, and his grandfather, Edward III, brought blood-soaked victories against the French and the Scots, he brought the table fork, the handkerchief, and Geoffrey Chaucer. Royal palaces were remade with radical new inventions like the private bathroom, the ballroom, and kitchens serving up jellies, pies, fritters, and stews, along with magnificent roast animals such as peacocks, seals, porpoises, and even whales, all waiting to be eaten on the royal table. Sugar sculptures called subtleties came shaped as castles, ships, and even scenes from fables. Richard and Anne led the court in outrageous fashions. For men, that meant jeweled, high-collared robes, expensive doublets, tight hose, and massive codpieces. For ladies, that meant fitted gowns so tight they couldn't even eat at the dining table, and shoes so long they had to tie jeweled garters to their knees and then to the tips of the shoes so they wouldn't trip over them. And there was little room here for the veterans of the 100 Years' War, like John of Gaunt, Edmund Langley, and Thomas Woodstock, who fumed, while new favorites like Robert de Vere, John Beauchamp, and John Salisbury milked the king for everything they could get: castles, estates, and titles. Now, if the nobles were displeased about Richard's favorites, they were enraged by his failure to protect England. French and Castilian ships prowled the English Channel like wolves, hunting merchant ships, while what remained of the English navy rotted in port. Burning and plundering raids by French privateers became so bad that the merchants of London tried to raise a giant chain across the River Thames. Since Parliament did not want to send the army to France so soon after the Peasants' Revolt, Richard went after the French garrisons in Scotland closer to home. Along the way, he made dukes of his two favorites, Edmund Langley and Thomas Woodstock, even inventing them new titles. Of course, Richard's friends' grand new titles did little for the war effort. The Scots retreated and pursued a scorched earth strategy, burning crops and slaughtering livestock, so that the English would have nothing to live on. They even burned the city of Carlisle to ashes. By the time that King Richard came to Edinburgh, he found that he could no longer feed his army and had to go home with no victory. And the next year he faced the wonderful Parliament of 1386, which denounced his favorites as parasites, leeches, and outright criminals, bleeding the treasury dry, and they'd pay no new taxes until they were gone. Usually cool and detached, King Edward threw a spit-spewing tantrum, replying that he would not do so much as a scullion boy from his kitchen. Then he stomped out of Parliament, and his uncles, led by John of Gaunt, had to go after him all the way to Westminster, where they convinced him that he risked his crown unless he returned to Parliament. And while Richard did indeed return to Parliament, he didn't give them anything. A year later, King Richard tried to raise an army to force Parliament to accept his policy of government by favourite. And Richard was only further humiliated when the county sheriffs refused to raise any soldiers for him, so he had to beg his favorite, Robert de Vere, to loan him his army to grind Parliament under his boot heel. And when Robert showed up, he was crushed by Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, at the Battle of Radcote Bridge. He fled to France, and then a group of 5 nobles calling themselves the Lords Appellant set out to clean Richard's house, whether he liked it or not. The list of charges took 2 hours to read aloud in Parliament, and Richard's favourites were accused of high treason, selling English castles to the French, and stealing money from the treasury. For 4 months, Richard watched as dozens of his friends, flunkies, and favourites were dragged off and sentenced to exile, hanging, or being drawn and quartered. And then something funny happened. King Richard began to behave himself. He listened to the dukes for advice. He appointed honest men to office. But one area where he held the line was on peace with France. He refused to declare war, and the great lords reluctantly let him have his way. As easy as it is to criticize Richard for his poor choice in officials, we should remember that he did want peace with France. So why wasn't France taking advantage of this, as Parliament and the nobles feared they would? In 1386, King Charles VI had finally come of age. In the previous episode, we talked about how his uncles ran the government and ran it into the ground. The Duke of Anjou provoked a national uprising by imposing a wine tax, and another uncle, Philip the Bold, used those royal taxes to expand his personal duchy in Flanders at the expense of France. And the king had to put his house in order before he even thought about another war. So he brought back a group of rich commoners. They weren't nobles, they didn't have a duke or a marquis or a knight in their family tree, but they did know how to manage money. That didn't get them respect from the likes of Philip the Bold, who derided them as the marmosets, after stone creatures carved on French churches. However, these so-called marmosets, including Bureau de Rivere, Jean Le Mercier, and Jean de Montagnau, fired corrupt officials, most of whom were Philip the Bold's flunkies, restored self-government to Paris, and even set about removing sewage from the streets and the basements, no doubt to much rejoicing. The dukes and the king's uncles might spit upon them, but the marmosets were too busy saving France to care. Things were looking good, but they soon began to unravel. In 1392, a man tried to murder Olivier de Clisson, King Charles' best friend and advisor. Though Olivier survived, Charles personally led a party of knights to Brittany to arrest the would-be assassin. As the king and his escort rode through the forest near Le Mans, a barefoot hermit dressed in a ragged smock jumped out from behind a tree, seized the king's bridle, and cried out, "Turn back! My king, you are betrayed!" And the escort thanked the hermit by beating him from the road. He continued to follow the royal party for half an hour, screaming of betrayal, and about an hour after they were finally out of earshot, a page dropped the king's lance. And King Charles was so scared by the noise that he drew his sword and began raving that traitors wished to deliver him to the enemy. He wheeled and charged his horse, striking at any man within reach. No one dared to harm the king. They fended off his blows, but dared not return any. And at last, King Charles' chamberlain took him from behind, wrenched him off his horse, and threw away his sword. By then, King Charles had killed 4 of his own knights, and they took him to Paris, stone still and dead silent. Once word got out, people talked about sorcery, poison, or even the anger of God. And while the comatose king lay in his bed, the country was stricken with terror. Barefoot bishops led processions carrying life-size wax figures of the king. Sobbing priests conducted prayers for the king's health. People heaped offering on relics known for healing powers, and it must have worked because King Charles recovered a month later. However, King Charles of France returned to a political scene much changed. Philip the Bold, his uncle who had reconquered Flanders using the French treasury, seized power during the king's illness. He called a royal council in secret, declared the king's younger brother Louis too young to rule, and then arrested the marmosets. He confiscated their houses, their land, and their fortune. They remained in prison for 18 days, each day wondering if they were going to be executed. But once he decided they were no longer a threat, Philip the Bold simply released the marmosets, restored most of their property, and went about ruling the king's court. With King Charles II shaken to resume the throne, Philip the Bold took over, and he brought in a wave of outrageous new fashion. Men curled their hair and trimmed their beards into 2 points, while women made their hair into elaborate braided shells so large they had to turn sideways when entering a door. Magicians and mystery plays provided the entertainment. Costume had become more important than courage. However, the country was thrown into turmoil yet again when the king's uncles decided to hold a dance. An infamous degenerate named Hugo de Gisquet, who beat his servants with a sword while forcing them to bark like dogs, convinced a party of young nobles, including the king, to dance while disguised as woodland nymphs. They sewed themselves into linen costumes soaked in wax and pitch, with a covering of frazzled hemp so they appeared as hairy beasts. Then they took turns dancing among torchbearers, a terrible risk. These high-born and decadent youth found excitement in their dull lives by tempting death, dancing around open flames while covered in wood. The woodland dancers capered before the partiers in masks, howling like wolves and making obscene gestures as the partiers tried to guess who they were. Then, little brother Louis arrived with a torch and held it close, setting one of the dancers on fire by accident. He panicked and ran around the room. Several other dancers caught on fire. King Charles only survived because a duchess threw her skirts over him. Among those to die was Hugo de Gisquet, and when his coffin made his way through the streets, the peasants pounded on it and shouted, "Bark, you dog!" Not surprisingly, Charles' mental illness returned soon after the so-called Dance of the Burning Men. He forgot his own name and didn't recognize his wife Isabeau. His doctors treated him with enemas, which did very little. And while he could govern well in between psychotic episodes, those times became fewer and further between. At times, King Charles was convinced he was made of glass and hid in the cupboard, threatening immediate execution to anyone who dared touch him and risked breaking him. He even once refused to change his clothes or bathe, and his servants were once forced to forcibly bathe him just to get all of the feces off which had encrusted his skin. With the king increasingly unfit for rule, his uncle Philip the Bold became the effective king of France. He ruled in a council with the king's other uncles, along with Queen Isabeau. During this rule by the council, Queen Isabeau forced through a decree expelling the Jews from France in 1394. Most of the French Jews would settle in Poland, and this would have a disastrous effect on France in the years to come, as the Jews often worked in banking and money lending largely because laws prevented them from working anywhere else. And without money moving around, it's a lot harder to wage war. However, Philippe had one very conspicuous thorn in his side: Louis, Duke of Orléans, younger brother to King Charles. Louis must not have seemed like a savvy political operator. He was a handsome pleasure seeker who enjoyed the company of dancers and flatterers, and he was a compulsive gambler at chess, tennis, and cards. And even in an aristocratic culture where it was not uncommon to lose 2,000 francs in a single bet, he stood out. Nonetheless, if there was one thing that Louis liked more than a good flutter, it was power. And to take it from his uncle Philip the Bold, he sabotaged him at every turn. He squandered the money that was raised for the war effort in Flanders. He picked endless fights with him over lands and castles to waste time that could have been used for governing. And most important of all, there was an English exile living in France at the time, Henry Bolingbroke. You see, King Richard had given up on reasonable government and started singling out and punishing anybody who had been a part of the wonderful Parliament. And since Henry Bolingbroke was the heir apparent, being Richard's cousin, as Richard had no children of his own, the opposition could easily rally to him. So to head off this potential threat, Richard had Henry exiled. And when Henry's father, John of Gaunt, died, King Richard simply seized the Duchy of Lancaster for himself. And Louis, Duke of Orléans, sensing yet another chance to poke his uncle in the eye, connived to have Henry sent home. Of course, Philip the Bold wanted Henry to stay where he was. After all, King Richard back in England wanted peace, so why would he want anything to change? Yet in his rancor and relentless hunger for power, Louis did indeed help Henry get home. And while Henry became Henry IV, He had a son named Henry V, who would inflict upon France its most humiliating and catastrophic defeat in the war yet. And that wraps things up for this episode of Channel Legendarium. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if there's anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again in a couple of days.